Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Telecom video, we're going to be continuing our discussions of Albert Penello's recent comments. This time we're going to be discussing the comments of the GPU, as well as coherent memory bandwidth and a few other bits and pieces. So I'm going to start things off by reading out the quote that we're going to lead things off with, and that is 18 CUs versus 12 CUs, 50% more performance. Multi-core processors have inherent inefficiency with more CUs, so it's simply incorrect to say 50% more GPU. He then adds to this by saying, adding to that, each of our CUs is running 6% faster. It's not simply a 6% clock speed increase overall. So, what is exactly Albert claiming? Well, fairly simply, he's claiming that games don't necessarily scale very well with higher amounts of CUs, compute units, or the GCN cores, in other words, the building blocks, of course, of the GPUs for both the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. Now, each of the GCN units themselves actually have 64 stream processors, meaning the Xbox One has a grand total of 768, while 1152 is what the PlayStation 4 can boast. So what does this mean? Well, the basic theory is that some games titles, some game engines don't respond so well to environments with multiple core GPUs. And he's basically saying that scaling, therefore, doesn't necessarily indicate real-world scenarios where you're going to get, 50% more just because you have 50% more GPU cores. So, what are my thoughts to this? Because it's a fairly interesting claim. Well, there's a few things. The first is that different GPUs do indeed scale differently. And different games do indeed, from what, if we're going with PCs, so we'll use that as a base to start off with, different games do, and different game engines, more to the point, do inherently have different efficiencies. However, there are a couple of things I'd like to counter with. Firstly, it's a closed platform environment. So when you're talking about, say, the PlayStation 4, we're dealing with a system that isn't going to change over time, right? So, in other words, the developers, even if there was something horribly wrong with the PlayStation 4, let's just assume it had really bad CPU. I'm not saying it does, I'm just saying assume for a moment it did. Well, developers would get around it. They would, for example, offload more stuff to compute, or they would, write game engines somehow or another to not utilize so much CPU power. The same thing for if the engine had, say, issues with, say, the cache or whatever else. In other words, they would get around it somehow or another. They always do. So, with closed platform environments, typically you're going to get situations where the developers, over a long period of time, and we're talking, 2 years, 3 years down the line, which isn't super long, but it's certainly not in the immediate future, when developers really get a handle on what they're really doing with the systems, it's really going to me at least, mean that systems are going to start pulling ahead more. Now, we can start looking at situations where you're doing crossfire. Now, crossfire on a PC is pretty simple. Let's say you were to buy a Radeon HD 7970 graphics card. I'll repeat that again, 7970. And that's, for all intents and purposes, based upon the same GPU structure, though, of course, both systems have had, the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 have had a few things done to their GPUs specifically, but for the most part, they're pretty similar in terms of structure. So, if you were to take a look at a couple of games, and you, by the way, can do some Googling on this by all means, but titles on the 7970 do get a very high efficiency rating. How high? Well, about 98 to, high 90s to, almost 100%. However, and this is the really key part, it does depend heavily on what the graphics settings are. Titles, for example, at 1080p on the PC, GPUs are so bloody fast now on the PC that 1080p with low levels of anti-aliasing or lower graphics settings, you're not going to get that much scaling because the CPU is typically going to start holding you back. But once you start adding higher resolutions or high levels of AA, and very high texture quality and so on, then you start getting situations where the scaling starts to improve quite significantly. Furthermore, okay, I completely agree that the fact that the Xbox One did get a clock speed increase, it's almost 7% if Albert wants to be, technical on this, but okay, if he wants to call it 6, fine. Obviously, in certain aspects, in certain situations, you are going to have a benefit from that. No one is disputing that. But the thing is, I don't think anyone sensible is going to say, well, games developers are just going to want to not highly parallelize their titles, because it just doesn't make sense to. Early on, sure, I can see situations where we're going to get games which aren't that much better looking on the PS4. I could even understand, 2 years down the line. And we might even get situations where the Xbox One titles and the PS4 titles have some level of similarities. For example, the graphical quality overall on both systems may be the same. Developers have already started to state that the PS4 is 40 to 50% faster than the Xbox One. These include things such as the memory. These include the ALUs, these include the GPUs, as a whole, really, actually, just to be honest with you. And there are even statements such as, what was the title now? Without optimizations for either console, a platform-agnostic development build can run at around 30 FPS at 1080p on the PS4, but it'll run at 20-something FPS at 1600 by 900 on the Xbox One, and the Xbox One is weaker and it's a pain to use its ESRAM. Microsoft a few times now have hinted, although not confirmed, that they have done some stuff in the background to the Xbox One's GPU. We know that it does have 2 graphic instruction blocks and 2 compute, which is obviously far below what the PlayStation 4 does in terms of compute. However, it has been hinted that they have actually increased the queue count of compute instructions. However, with the lack of a volatile bit that the PlayStation 4 does have, to basically completely and utterly allow the level 2 cache to be utilized very heavily with compute without the need to completely flush the cache, it's very difficult to know how effective it's going to be. It's likely the Xbox One would be very good at compute using the cloud, and of course we've had developers stating that they're going to be using like 600% of the Xbox One's power from the cloud. The Forza developers have said very similar, but that's not really on the console, is it? Now, to add to the rumours from previously regarding the ESRAM and how well it's tied to the GPU, one of the theories is that the ESRAM is going to be very tied with tiled resources. Now, we know what tiled resources are, of course, by now. They are a DirectX 11.2 feature set, and the basic theory is that the closer you get to an object, the better the texture quality becomes. Tiled resources actually requires very little memory, and 16 megabytes can be like addressing several gigabytes of textures. The problem with tiled resources and the ESRAM, from what we understand, and bear in mind Microsoft have not confirmed this, but from what developers have said, firstly, it appears that it is a very difficult thing to use completely, because it appears that you need to manually fill and flush the memory. So, to put that into perspective, you need to actually program the use of the ESRAM. It's not an automated process, and therefore it adds to development time, therefore developers don't really like it that much. In addition to that, one of the people working at Lab Zero Games said that there was a story going around at E3, and it was pretty much this isn't verbatim, as in he can't remember it exactly, but the quote was pretty much, ATVI was doing the COD Ghosts port to next gen. It took 3 weeks for the PS4 and came out at 90 FPS unoptimized, and 4 months on the Xbox One and came out at 15 frames per second. So I just want to reiterate that one more time. For the PS4, 3 weeks, 90 FPS. The Xbox One, it took 4 months and came out all on optimized, of course, at 15 FPS. Now, I'd like to hasten to add that this has not been confirmed by Microsoft, by Sony, or whatever, all the developers. So you can add some salt to this, you know, a few pinches of it, if you will, but it is still a rumour that's going about. Add to this another bit of confusion on the ESRAM. Now, I did mention this, and I did say this video is going to be a bit itsy-bitsy, but I did mention a lot of the ESRAM stuff previous video. But Albert Penello has added to the confusion of the ESRAM with yet another quote. I'm not quite sure exactly how to take this, so I'm going to read you guys it out. This comes to us from NeoGAF, and I'm not a member, however, still I read it occasionally. And someone asked him, so why is the directional bandwidth of the ESRAM 204 gigabytes per second, although your one-way directional bandwidth is 109, so 109 times 2, shouldn't that be 218? Now, there were a couple of theories floating about before Albert answered this. One is that obviously there was a little bit of inefficiency with the bidirectional. So people thought that Microsoft were possibly quoting more realistic numbers rather than going with the highest possible bandwidth. Another theory was that there was something going on with the clock speed of the RAM or something that we just didn't understand. However, Albert has since commented on this, and I'm going to read you guys out the quote. He responded, "Yes, it should be. And I was quickly corrected both on the forum and from people at the office for writing the wrong number." So in other words, Albert was writing the incorrect number, and the ESRAM should actually be 218 gigabytes per second. And then he said, "I will stand by what I stated except for the aforementioned 204/218. In fact, some really interesting threads were going back and forth, giving me some excruciating detail behind these numbers based on the questions people asked." End quote, because he then goes on to some other stuff that's not really important. So, okay, the problem with this is, and this is the issue I have. He actually said in one of the original posts that he'd actually run these numbers by people who were supposedly in the know. He basically ran it by one of the leads of the Xbox One, and the guy said that that was the number. He actually said that the number was indeed 204. Now, it's possible, to be fair, that the guy just read it, skimmed it, didn't see the exact number, and thought to himself, that's it, fine. You know, maybe he didn't do the calculations, maybe he was a bit distracted when he was reading it. The other problem with all of this is that the slides, which were posted on the Hot Chips conference, you guys remember those, I'm sure, they actually showed 204 gigabytes per second as well. So what's going on there? Well, one theory is that the slides were made before the upclock of the GPU, which could be possible. So, for example, Bob's working in the office. It's Bob's task to, sort out the slides for the presentation, and Bob does his thing. Someone forgets to tell Bob that Microsoft are going to be, for the final production yields, increasing the clock speed by 53 megahertz, right? That's possible. I can buy that. Because, stuff like that slips out all of the time. People are really quick to say, well, Microsoft is a huge company. How can the left hand not know what the right hand's doing? Because of this, it's like when you get a company that's, got so many people working for it. When you're talking about technical slides and so on in environments, it's really, really easy to have multiple copies of the same file. It's easy to forget to tell someone who's responsible for the documentation. Goodness knows what else. And this is coming from someone who actually, myself, who's actually working in a company, and so many times I've forgotten to update one little version number or something like that on my own documentation, and then I go back to it and I'm like, oh, really? Now, I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm not defending Microsoft, because this is the problem. There are so many pieces of information that we're not 100% sure about with the Xbox One, and I do kind of wish that Microsoft would just clear some of this up. I do respect the fact that Albert has come on to forums such as NeoGAF. He's actually given interviews on other places as well, other forums, I believe Reddit and a couple other locations, and he has tried to give his thoughts, his opinions, and so on. But the problem is, it's very difficult because sometimes he's giving different explanations which don't quite make sense to people. So with all of the different questions regarding the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, do I agree with everything that Albert Penello has said? Not really. I think there's a lot of questions still. And another issue that I've been reading about recently regards to the Xbox One's graphics drivers, the libraries, and so on. Developers are being a lot more vocal than they have been, and now that launch is coming up, after all, now that means that developers have actually had some time to get used to the kit. Now they're starting to, well, their words, not mine, but they are basically calling the Xbox One's drivers right now pretty damn horrible. Regards to the memory, to the actual graphics, and one of the primary reasons behind this is the ESRAM, but they're saying that effectively they're getting less performance than they should be. One of the theories behind all of this is that Microsoft, back in the day, like before the Xbox One was known as the Xbox One, when it was known as Durango, and while the PlayStation 4 was known as Orbis, in other words, before the official revealings, they actually were known to be behind the PlayStation. The Xbox One was known to be behind the PlayStation regarding a development. In fact, there was a couple of rumors that were circulating, I remember covering them, that not only were titles falling behind on the Xbox One, difficulties with development or being postponed in development, but some of the actual libraries and so on the Xbox One weren't ready yet. There are a couple of theories behind this, and I guess some of this is starting to tie together now, because if you think about it, it does make sense. If you do some research on, by yourselves, you can see that developers have said that it's very quick to get a PS4 title up and running from a port from the PC. But the reverse is true of the Xbox One. It seems to take a lot longer, 2, 3, 4 times longer. And I can only ascertain and guess the reasons behind this, because I'm not, porting the titles myself, but I have feelings that a lot of this is to do with, well, the ESRAM. I have a feeling that it's going to be a pain. I have a feeling that they're going to manually need to do a lot of coding. I think driver updates could possibly help. Better libraries could possibly help as well, because it's still fairly early on. Look, the PS3 was awful when it first came out. We all know this, but the thing of it is, look, that's the PS3 versus the Xbox 360. One of the differences that a lot of people cite is, look, even if you want to say the Xbox 360 was 20% more powerful, right? Even if you want to say that, the bottom line is the systems were fairly comparable. One had a better CPU, one had a better GPU, one had better memory, but overall the systems were relatively similar. This time, that's just simply not the case. Both systems are actually using very similar hardware. When you really boil it down, both using x86 processors, even the same type of processor. One's, of course, processor is a little bit faster, and moreover, they're even using the same GPUs. The difference is just the clock speed's a smidgen higher on the other one, but you get a bucket load more, well, GPU processors on the other. And so most people are already saying, well, there's a very good chance that we're going to be seeing 1080p or, high 900p on the PS4 versions at either 30 or 60 frames per second, and the Xbox One titles, meanwhile, are going to be at 720p. Killer Instinct, for example, has already been confirmed to be 720p. I'm not saying that we're going to get situations like that all the time, however. I think that the PS4 and the Xbox One, however, are going to have some noticeable differences in regards to multi-platform titles, and I think that it's going to be quite noticeable in later generation titles, unless there's a significant improvement. So anyway, that's just about it on this particular subject. Obviously, we've still got lots more to cover, but I wanted to finish this off since I'd, half finished the analysis and all. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.